everybody, and welcome to the show. I have as guests with me Nicholas Richardson and Guy Pinsent, and we're going to be talking about all things royal and the funeral of the Queen, the takeover of the throne, not the takeover, but the ascension to the throne of Prince Charles, and a little bit of history about these things. But first, may I just read a little something? Hope you don't mind. It's over. The longest reigning British monarch has died. Queen Elizabeth II, as they say, the Queen is dead. Long live the King. It often seems to the modern eye that the monarchy would be, the idea of having a monarch would be something that should have been given up a long time ago. But there's a long tradition in Britain, stretching back to the annals of history and even of myth, to the time of King Arthur and others, Boadicea, who performed, but Arthur particularly performed the miracle of pulling the immovable sword from the stone to suggest the magic and mystery of monarchy. There's a reason we remember these kind of legends. You've all heard the story, and some of you have seen it in film and even in animation. To be the longest-serving monarch, 70 years in a, say, a millennial and a half or so of kings and queens and prince regents and usurpers and royal and otherwise, we're talking of Oliver Cromwell there, it may be, she may be one of the greatest of all of these rulers, simply through her rectitude and her and the spirit she embodied and the example that she set. It's if you say what you will about monarchy, everyone has their own view. Many loved her. This is obvious from what we witnessed in the funeral. Even those who are skeptical about whether or not monarchy should continue. The symbolic leadership she showed is appreciated and lives on. Under her namesake, Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, as she was known, and the person for whom my home state, Virginia, was named, she presided, Queen Elizabeth I, that is, presided over the beginning of the largest empire the world has ever seen, the one that the sun supposedly never set on, as what people say. Elizabeth I was there at the beginning of this show, just as Elizabeth II reigned over the dismantling of the empire. Okay, scandals? There have been worse than what's taken place under Queen Elizabeth's rule, both secular and in the monarchy. That's part of life. No one is perfect, and no family is perfect, as we all know. At any rate, you have princes in the Tower, the crouch-back Richard, the impaling of Edward II, and the madness of King George, just to name a few. Shakespeare had enough material to create a whole series of histories. And I suggest you might look at those at some point, or read those, or go and see the plays, and see that not much changes, except that the rectitude and the elegant propriety of Queen Elizabeth II is gone. And while that is gone, we can say that her grace lives on, and if you will allow me, we may never see her like again. Welcome.
Thank you.
Nice to see you. Yeah.
Nice to be back.
You. Now, gosh, I feel lucky to have you both here because not only are you good friends, but you've been on the other channels talking, both of you, about this, about the funeral, which was yesterday.
It was. I watched it more or less from start to finish. I had it on my iPad while I had my work on my computer
What was your
screen.
opinion of it?
Well, I thought it was magnificent. I mean, the actual spectacle, the way it was put together, fantastic tribute, I think, to the organisation of the Earl Marshal of England, of course, who's been doing this for several hundred years. Not him, but it's a hereditary office, and he's responsible for organising all state events. And so there's that accumulated wisdom, which is, of course, one of the benefits of tradition, accumulated wisdom. And, of course, tremendous work by the armed forces who took part. The training, the perfection. When you watch the way the coffin was put onto the gun carriage, removed, put on again, the way the sailors pulled the gun carriage, the horsemanship, the marching, absolutely magnificent. The whole thing was just, and the music, the trumpeters and the bands, absolutely fantastic achievement for everybody. And indeed, even something as simple as the procession from Westminster Abbey to the Wellington Arch, also magnificent. That's a long walk for people to do. You forget those people were marching, and then those that were marched by the coffin again in Windsor, members of the royal household, Her late Majesty's equerries. I mean, there was a lot of walking to do. So the whole thing, I think, was just magnificent. Made you proud to be British.
Thank you, Nicholas. Guy?
I would second all of that, and also look at how the whole world stopped to watch that state funeral. We've never seen the like of it. And every world leader wanted to be there. That was the power of this wonderful Queen Elizabeth, who's already
Was she not the most famous person in the world now
Absolutely.
that Muhammad Ali is no longer around?
Absolutely, the most photographed woman
Yeah, I think so.
in history. And I was told yesterday, I'm not sure who counts these things up, that over 4 billion people worldwide tuned in to watch the state funeral. I mean, that's quite incredible.
Well, I think President Macron summed it up when he's in his own broadcast in English, which was actually very good, I thought. He said, to you, she is your queen. To us, she is the queen. And I think that summed it up.
I think that goes for Americans as well.
Yeah, exactly.
But I was talking to my aunt, and she watches all the shows and everything, and she's I wouldn't say she's an Anglophile, but she's certainly very up on these sort of things. A lot of women tend to really enjoy that pageantry and the history, and particularly, I think, Queen Elizabeth, at least in my family. And but she said, do we really need a monarchy? What do they do? And I think there's a question that's on many people's minds. Now, I lived in Britain for quite a while, went to a university there, one or two, and you are British by birth. How do you answer that question? What good is the monarchy? What do they do?
Well, like all of these things, in a free society with democracy, these things are hotly debated, so they should be. I've seen comments recently in the last week from people saying, I respect the Queen, but I can never support a monarchy as a true democrat. And I think that rather misses the point, because the Queen doesn't have any power. It's a symbolic role which ties, the point that people really don't understand who are anti-monarchy is this ties the nation's history together through nearly 1,000 years.
I was trying to make that point.
Nearly 1,000 years of history. Of course, the extreme left would then go on to say, well, we don't like the idea of nations anymore anyway, it should all be one global mishmash. But I think people want to have symbols to look up to, rocks on which to stand, a flag to rally around is, I think, very important in binding nations together. And for those reasons, I think the monarchy does a fantastic job. You can also look at pure, quite boring points about economics and tourist dollars bought in, etc.
That's not boring. I think that, no, let's talk about that, because that's one of the things I said to my aunt. Is I said, don't forget.
No, but a lot of people do forget that she is, in fact, or she and the king now is a constitutional monarch, which actually means that they rule by virtue of an act of parliament, ultimately. So the people have decided in 1688 and thereafter how it would be.
1688, Glorious Revolution.
The Glorious Revolution. And the interesting part, one of the fascinating things this time round was because, of course, 70 years ago, people didn't have television, and there were not television cameras allowed into, for example, the fascinating Accession Council. Now, the moment Queen Elizabeth died, then King Charles became king. But it was a subsequent meeting of the Privy Council, the Accession Council, and a ritual which goes back to the annals of time, where he was officially and appointed as king, officially confirmed as king.
Proclaimed.
Proclaimed as king, and then you have these marvellous characters like the Garter King of Arms reading out the proclamation from the balcony in Friary Court in St James's Palace, the official seat of the monarch. Marvellous stuff. It takes us right back to the Middle Ages. Now, when you think, what is the point of the monarchy? The point of monarchy is because all of us, whatever our station or place in life, we all have to have a sense of belonging. And indeed, the late Roger Scruton, if you ever read any of his philosophy,
If I've ever read Roger Scruton.
all his philosophy started with this idea of place.
Yeah.
Each of us finding our place in the world.
Yeah.
And I think under a monarchy, we have that place with the monarch. That gives us our place in the world.
Right.
And this is something above politics, because we have, to varying degrees these days particularly, but it's probably been true throughout history, various degrees of scoundrels of politicians. But the monarch and the monarchy gives us a higher value to which to aspire, a better example, and ties us into this sense of belonging, to be part of something, in this case, to be part of the monarchy.
Thank you for supporting my opening statements.
With
Both
pleasure.
of you so far.
But then you as an American would argue, well, we got rid of all that nonsense, and we've been the most successful Republican democracy which the world has ever seen. All true, and we don't need any of this. Every morning in American school, the children make a pledge to the American flag, and that's the sort of symbols of nationhood.
We
and so
hope
on.
that continues. Yeah.
So I'd ask you, how would you look
all
at
over
it
the place.
from the other side of the
For
pond?
me, I've always been Anglophile, and both of you are Catholic. I'm actually a member of the Anglican Church. So, which is also, when I was in England, I went to the Anglican Church, but that's Episcopalian in the United States. So that's where I was baptized and confirmed. So that's an interesting thing. Our histories in the old, between American and British history, and certainly in my case, many of my descendants are straight from there or Scandinavia. Okay, some Germans. Okay, we don't talk about the war.
Yes,
but this kind of thing.
Yeah.
So we're
cousins in Argentina.
yeah, you are. And not me, but I have friends who are that. No,
I mean,
mine were well before.
Some commentators have
even
said,
before 1870.
of course, effectively, that we have a hereditary presidency and you have an elected monarchy, essentially.
Well, there's a lot to be said about oligarchy. And the thing I noticed when I was in Britain, if I may.
You may, it's your show.
And please, jump in, is that I noticed in Britain that if you had something to say and you could turn up, with some polished shoes and polished attitude, you could go anywhere and be welcome. This is not the case in America.
No, it's not.
People, it's a totally different way of looking at things. You see, in Britain there's certain signals, and they come from this long tradition, and people pick those up. And in the United States, it's not true.
Yeah.
I mean, as long as you got some money, you join the country club and, act out as much as you like, and people will put up with it.
But we're also seeing in contemporary United...
I'm not saying that acting out is not fun.
No, but in contemporary United States, we're seeing how divisive the presidency has become. You're either a Republican or a Democrat. Whereas, of course, in the United Kingdom, the monarchy is a unifying figure. The Queen was, and the King will be, above politics. And they keep their opinions to themselves. I mean, the Queen famously never gave an interview in all the 70 years on the throne. Remarkable.
Yeah. Well, why would she?
Well, we know a bit more about the Prince of Wales' opinions on some things, but even he has said that as king, obviously, he will have to take a different approach to life.
Yes.
And
she shouldn't actually give interviews.
She shouldn't be. It's pointless because
it's also them interfering.
They are this unifying figure. And that is very important, because the alternative is... Sorry,
no, go ahead, I'm sorry.
The alternative, would we want a President Blair or a President Johnson or a President Gordon Brown, or any... Because that's what we would have, some retread politician, and I think that would be...
You remind me of Richard Harris' character in Unforgiven by Clint Eastwood.
Yeah, exactly. We wouldn't want...
Who wouldn't shoot a president, but the awe and majesty of a queen?
Well, he's absolutely right. Absolutely right, of course.
Absolutely.
But I mean, that is the issue. I mean, and it would just become... We would lose that. And I think that tradition, those values, that feeling of mystique, the thing which because we would have, I would have no connection, and feel no connection with an elected person in the way I can feel a connection with a monarch, which may sound very odd because I never met the Queen.
Listen, you can even look at let's look at two figures in Britain who are famous commentators, Christopher and Peter Hitchens. Very different. They both started out as Trotskyites, and Christopher Hitchens' reformed bit came to the center and recognized certain threats that would not be solved by Trotskyite Trotskyitism, and I think enjoyed the capitalism of the United States, in which he was able to make quite a good amount of money as a writer in a free society, and one of the best. But Peter Hitchens, who is definitely come from Trotskyite to monarchist, if you're familiar with Peter Hitchens, interesting guy. And he says exactly the same thing that you're saying, that the symbolism, and the idea. Here's another thing, if I can throw it out: the idea that someone is above corruption, something and someone is above corruption. Okay, and then we have. It's not the worst, and I mentioned some others in the past. There have been some really terrible things that happened. Henry VIII was chopping off heads and, getting rid of, knocking off wives, queens, lickety split. But and we have the problem of Prince Andrew, and we have the problem of Harry taking the 200 million and leaving the country. It's a bit like Eve in the Garden of Eden saying to Adam, it's just not quite enough, is it? Perfection. It's just not quite enough.
Yes, well, because those are two very different things. I mean, for what it's worth, I think Prince Andrew's greatest crime was to be naive, and it's part of the problem of being royalty. You never really know who your friends are. Your whole life, even if you're a minor royal, is sort of set out for you. You don't have a lot of discretion. They are guilty of naivety. I don't, for what it's worth, believe for one moment that Prince Andrew is guilty of what is alleged he got up to with this young woman. And indeed, in that particular case, and I don't want to dwell on that, even one of the other young women involved said that this Guthrie person had herself been involved in procuring other young women for Mr. Epstein.
Yeah,
so
let's not go into too much of that.
I don't get it, but my point is, the scandal, yes, it is, and I think he's guilty of naivety.
Yeah.
And the circumstance of being royal, I mean, you can't actually fight your corner in quite the same way you could as a civilian person, and I think because it was the Queen's...
Well, guilty until proven...
Platinum Jubilee...
Innocent until proven...
And I think also the other factor is that, there was no criminal case has been alleged against him, and of course, the other point with the United States is your criminal justice system is completely and utterly unjust.
Well, that's not...
I don't get it.
We're going too far. I don't want to go that far.
You raise this as a scandal, so I think yes. But these are minor members of the family out of the direct line of succession, so really not a problem ultimately,
right?
In my view.
Yeah.
I feel sorry for Prince Harry, because I'm sure this weekend or this week, while he's been in England and seen what the rest of the family is getting up to, he will miss it, because he's now, with all due respect, stuck with this sort of vacuous pseudo showbiz community in Southern California. He probably goes to the polo club to play polo, but has no real friends.
Well, all of them used to be the Hollywood stars. All wanted to be royalty.
Exactly.
Now the royalty wants to be Hollywood stars. It doesn't make any sense.
They withdrew from the royal family. They didn't want to do the duty. But the fact even today, their only status in Southern California is because they're associated with royalty.
Correct.
And I think Prince Harry must be leading actually...
That's where the money came from.
A miserable life there, I suspect.
They got the deals because of the royal connection,
and they've spent
not because of their own individual talent.
So they're now spending their time trashing the thing, biting the hand which fed them, ultimately.
Okay, it's a point that needs to be said when you raise the subject. So, anything to add on that?
Well, I'd just say that I think the Queen has really established the monarchy by not putting a foot wrong.
Yeah.
And this is why there is this yearning in this world, which I think it really started to fall apart after Margaret Thatcher was sort of deposed, and it became very much, or maybe earlier. I was too young perhaps to remember before, but there does seem to be this lack of respect for one's elders, and complete, breakdown in families and society, which the Queen stood above, and there's now this yearning for stability and
perhaps
having an example set, and so King Charles III has a very hard act to follow. And while we're talking about scandals, the dissenters, the anti-monarchists, are being quiet and deferential, of course, in the last 10 days since Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II died. But you can be quite sure they're going to relight scandals involving him in the not too distant future. Just in the last summer,
Yeah.
he was in some potential hot water for allegedly accepting large dollops of cash from some Saudis or some other.
Yeah, well,
Arabians.
Sorry, who was?
charities for which
For his charities.
For the charities.
King Charles.
He didn't, obviously, personally.
The former Prince of Wales, yeah.
But I mean, this
Yeah.
is part of the... People will set out to find something wrong even when there is nothing wrong. And the point is, if they're ever successful, then they will regret it. Because the monarchy gives us something which we cannot get from anybody else.
It's so human to me, because it's an example of not being satisfied with what, people get everything and they're still not satisfied, which is the joke, again, about the Garden of Eden.
I mean, the text on this actually is Animal Farm. Because if you want to read Trollope's The Warden, similar sort of thing in
Anthony Trollope.
Yes,
they wrote the long series of books.
One of his short books, which is very good, is The Warden. Again, a charitable hospital. And everybody decides they want to remove the warden for completely spurious reasons. They succeed, and the new chap comes in, and life becomes miserable for them all. And they rather wish they'd had the warden playing his cello and generally being nice to them, but it was too late. They got rid of it, they lost it, they couldn't get it back, and life was more miserable for them.
And it's an interesting point about Animal Farm. Just can you give us a little more about why you think that's?
Because it was the animals or the pigs leading this revolution, saying they could make life better if we deposed the farmer, and of course they didn't.
Yeah.
They deposed the farmer, and life got worse and worse and worse, including leading to the execution of the horse.
It's the central paradox.
I mean, who's the manager of the horse?
Yes,
it's the central paradox of Marxist ideology. In pursuit of utopia, you end up with dystopia, I think.
Exactly.
Correct.
All the animals were equal, but some were more equal than others.
It all goes back to Eve and the garden,
the pigs became humans.
We can do better than this.
And this is folk forget this. They think, oh, these people, they live in palaces. I defy anybody who's watching this program, with one or two limited exceptions, to put in the amount of work and effort which the Queen put in. At 96, 2 days before she died, she was still doing her job. There aren't many other 96-year-olds still working, one or two, of course. But the point is, we think, oh, she lives in a palace, or she lived in a palace, and the king lives in a number of palaces. Isn't it wonderful? No, it must be miserable. You and I wouldn't want to do it.
No.
From whatever time you get up in the morning, no privacy at all. Constant meetings, papers, meetings, papers. And so he may have the odd day when he's out to do a bit of gardening or whatever. But the reality is, none of us would want to do it.
And always a consistent amount of roundheads who don't like you.
Yeah, exactly.
Traditionally, want to get rid of you. It can't be pleasant. I wouldn't want that job. But if I were born into it, I'd do.
Well, you'd hope to be able to do it like the late Queen did it.
I'd hope to be able to follow through.
Yes.
Just as one is supposed to, and that's the example that we're missing from Harry, but not from William. And may I add, just as we go to break, may I add that William the Conqueror William I started the reign of kings and queens of Britain, and in 1066, at the Battle of Hastings, he won. Came over with his Vikings from France, didn't he? And that's a good story, isn't it?
It is.
And I just hope that when William will be able to. He seems like a good guy.
Yeah.
And Kate would make a great queen. I hope that he'll get his chance, and it won't end under his reign. Okay, we'll be right back. Watch these thrilling messages and memorize them. Hello, everybody, and welcome back. Hope you enjoyed those messages as much as we didn't, and because we didn't see them. Let's be honest. We went and had coffee, but we're back. And I'm with, in the studio, of course, Nicholas Richardson, and of course, Guy Pinsent. Thank you very much for being here. I know you're both very busy.
We are. You're lucky to have us.
Yeah, I know. Lucky that you'll even talk to me.
Yeah,
well,
after that last time at the pub. Great Scott.
Exactly.
That was terrible. Anyway, I still have a hangover. That was 6 months ago. At any rate, Guy Pinsent, ex-Foreign Office, well-known entrepreneur about these parts in Central Europe, and Nicholas Richardson, a journalist, I believe, and
So it seems.
Yeah, and also entrepreneur and the vice president of
Vice chairman.
Vice chairman. I was going to say vice head, actually. I got it wrong again. Vice chairman of the British Polish Chamber
yes,
of Commerce. You know, so I just thought I'd say who you are and what you do a little bit for those people who haven't watched the show before, haven't seen you. At any rate, so in the opening statement, which went on far too long, but I did the best I could with, I mentioned the beginning of the Queen Elizabeth I and Queen Elizabeth II and the sort of space in between. Things kind of kicked off with Queen Elizabeth I, who almost didn't make it.
Absolutely.
Because her father was, Henry VIII. Pretty mean guy. Her mother was Anne Boleyn, is that correct? Who was her mother?
Anne Boleyn.
I believe it was Anne Boleyn.
It was Anne Boleyn.
Yeah. Which was another reason he was kind of like watching her, you know, going, I may have gout, but I'm not dead yet, right? As he played his real tennis, hopping about on one leg, you know, down there. Where was he? In Hampton Court or something?
Hampton
down
Court,
on the
yeah.
Thames?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I told him, gosh, a beautiful place. And so it all starts there for the empire. It really starts with Henry VIII, who builds the navy, right? Who has the idea of a navy. And oh gosh, we got Spanish down there, building ships, getting all the gold, traveling all about the world. Pretty soon they're going to come get us, right?
Yeah, I think it started under Elizabeth I as a defense against an existential threat from Spain. You know, Elizabeth I, she was excommunicated herself in 1570, and the Spanish, you know, were assembling their armada.
By the Pope.
By the Pope.
Your Pope.
Our Pope.
Well, I don't think it'd be
Because you're both Catholic.
Can't be excommunicated by anybody else.
Yeah. Right. It's a
I
good
think
point.
you'll find.
You've made a good point.
I have made an excellent
But, you
point.
know,
Again, I'll be waiting for more.
Yeah, good.
I'm sure I'll have them.
Spain was, you know,
We'll all have them.
Spain was getting very wealthy with all their plundering of South America and so on, and so to sort of get back at Spain, Elizabeth I decided to let the pirates have a go, and in fact supported the English pirates to take out these Spanish vessels. It was a very early example of state-sponsored terrorism. A nice, easy,
an interesting way
cheap
of putting it.
That's exactly what it was.
State-sponsored piracy, anyway.
Yeah, so
Privateering.
Privateering, exactly.
Is your word
Yes,
the other day
privateering.
when we were talking.
So by the 1580s, Spain had had enough and started assembling their armada with the full intention to take out Elizabeth I and conquer Britain. So it was a big deal.
And silent Shakespeare.
Indeed, and then
That was on their list.
And then Elizabeth, you know, so she calls in the greatest sailor of the day, who just circumnavigated the world, Sir Francis Drake, and says, "Now look here, Francis, I'd like you to go down and go and burn some of these Spanish ships in preparation." So the so-called singeing of the King of Spain's beard happened in, I think, spring.
The singeing of his beard.
That's what it's known as.
Yeah.
So Sir Francis Drake assembled
some
ships and essentially was raiding the Spanish.
Just took off a little bit, just burned a little bit of the
Well, he
beard.
managed to burn a whole bunch of their fleet and supply preparations in 1587.
And where was that?
In Cadiz.
Cadiz Harbor, which was the home of their navy.
Yeah,
right?
and that one delayed the Spanish Armada attack by at least a year, and secondly, it meant that they had to use new oak for their barrels, which ended up meaning their supplies sort of rotted and didn't survive as long, which was part of their demise during the attack.
The big empire was Spain. They had no idea. The British had no idea. It was kind of defensive. It was also sort of, you know, let's take a little bit where we can. And Drake was a great sailor. Also Walter Raleigh, and others, but the two most prominent, perhaps. And then start off in the place called the New World. Now, the Spanish are all off down in the southern places. We got to go somewhere a little bit north. The Spanish were as far as Florida, and they hadn't gone further north because they had their hands full with Mexico and the rest of Central and South America. Okay, so that's the beginning.
And the big questions,
of the whole thing.
The big questions are, why? How did this happen? How did this relatively small bunch of cold rocks off the northwest coast of Europe end up creating this biggest empire the world has ever seen.
Good Roman training, was it? I don't know.
I think, well, it was by accident to start with, but then it was actually developed through trade. Everyone assumes that the empire was just a brute force, and so on. You don't, as a small nation, occupy countries with brute force. It was cooperation and trade.
Yeah.
And the real jewel was India, many years later, which started as trade. And the Brits learnt also how to do finance from the Dutch, but put it on steroids, how governments could create debt, borrow from the future to build up the navy.
Britain learned a lot from the Dutch because the king, William of Orange, of course, came from Holland at the end of the...
Indeed.
After Charles II, wasn't it? Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. End of the
after-
1600s. Yeah.
After James II.
Yeah. Okay. Top that. That was pretty good.
Yeah.
What do you have to say? Can you carry us further on, Nicholas?
Yes, well, of course,
From
that's a
there?
good example of a revolution where you can avoid chopping the monarch's head off.
Yeah.
Set up the constitutional monarchy, which we have even unto this day.
Yeah.
Yes, and the guy's right. The empire was not actually, despite what the modern malcontents would have you believe, acquired as a military exercise. It would have been impossible. Traditionally, the United Kingdom always had a very small army. It had a big navy because ships were important if you're an island. And with the exception of perhaps parts of India, there was very little military conquest involved. It was essentially trading stations, coaling stations, and you just sort of kind of expanded through trade. And then all of a sudden, you found that, I think it was the Marquis of Salisbury, the third Marquis of Salisbury said that the British Empire was acquired in a fit of absent-mindedness.
Yes.
Which is, and people began out finding colonies, and Salisbury, who had a very dry sense of humour, would say, "Crikey, not another one! Bloody hell, what do we get to do with it?" Sort of thing.
Not another colony.
What's quite interesting is it was never run as a unified whole. It wasn't run like sort of the European Union is now, or the United States was. And indeed, at the beginning of the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, people like Joseph Chamberlain tried to have this sort of idea, this imperial single market, for want of a better phrase, because nobody was really bothered. So it was not run as a particularly money-making venture, which was why eventually it became too expensive to sustain it. And particularly after the Second World War, when essentially Churchill, because he wasn't a great economist, had to, of necessity, liquidate all our assets, and the Americans were waiting to pounce on our overseas markets, and that's essentially how it was.
Well, you just finished. Britain just finished paying off its World War II Lend-Lease a few years ago.
That was essentially. I mean, at the time.
What?
Well, it was World War I and then World War II.
Yeah. And it was just finished.
Broke the trade routes. That was the problem.
And the Americans took, I think, maybe understandably, took a very cynical view of World War II, and they saw it as an opportunity of dismantling the British Empire and themselves becoming the major English language-speaking trading nation, which they successfully did.
This is a subject I would love to go further into, but I'm afraid we need to stay on that.
But that's,
to me, fascinating subject.
Yeah, that's where we've got to. But yes, but you're right. Essentially, the British Empire was essentially a trading venture, which just got bigger and bigger and bigger.
Yeah.
Ultimately.
Okay, it's a trading, and you had the various colonial enterprises named for the colonies. There was a Virginia Bay Colony Company, and there was the East India Company. What was it called?
Well, the East India Company, exactly. That was essentially the empire in India.
Right, and then you had
private enterprise.
The other ones, right? And it's a good point you made about the Dutch, because they really did. Smaller countries, smaller population, not an island, other things on their mind, like painting great pictures, which the British didn't really get round to Gainsborough.
But if you're a smaller country and you have very few natural resources, then you do have to trade. Part of the problem with Spain was why the empire ultimately collapsed was they took all this gold and silver from the Americas.
Right.
And they didn't do anything with it. They just used it to spend it. They didn't sort of use it as a way of establishing a financial system which would allow business to be formed and to borrow money. And that's why the United Kingdom, or Great Britain, depending on which part of history you're looking at, was always once the formation of the Bank of England. Although we were a much smaller nation in terms of population and economy than France, the French government could never collect any money, ultimately, with its inefficient tax farming and things like that. Whereas with the Bank of England, we were able to establish credit for the British government, which it has never defaulted on 300 years later. And that enabled the massive expansion, enabled us to the extent we couldn't afford, didn't have our own army, we could hire other armies.
Yeah, that was
and
why
we could finance the navy, and we could do these sort of things.
the French didn't learn the lessons of this government debt creation, and that's why Britain repeatedly beat France when there were naval battles in the great game of empire building. And to this day, the French, I think, are pretty peeved about it.
Yes.
They're very.
But you're right. You go back to
They're rather
you go back to
disappointed
William.
that English is still the lingua franca.
Yes.
And
to use.
You go back to this William I. I mean, essentially, there has been between England and France, United Kingdom and France, this rivalry going back all these years. And I think it really, this will sound terrible to your viewers, but I'm going to say it anyway because it's that kind of show. I mean, I think as between France and England together...
There's a kind of show that says terrible things to the viewers?
No, it says things which we people don't want to hear.
Say what's on your mind.
I'm saying it about to, that France and England have determined between themselves that they are the two leading countries in the world, over everybody else. But as between whether it's France or England on top, they've had 1,000 years to try and work it out. But if you look at it historically, France and England are very similar in terms of what we've done, the colonies we've had, the influence we've had on the world. And that's very interesting as well. And that started off, obviously, with the Norman invasion coming with William I, which we sort of absorbed to create the modern England. And we were very lucky, I think, when you go back to the monarchy, which is what we're discussing. We were very lucky as a nation that our aristocracy were actually very responsible in a way, for example, the French aristocracy wasn't. And even to this day, they still play a major part in our lives, less so than many people suppose, but nevertheless, we still have 92 hereditary peers in the House of Lords. We still have the Earl Marshal of England organising state ceremonies. It's a hereditary post, as is the Lord Chamberlain, the Lord Great Chamberlain, not to be confused with the Lord Chamberlain.
We know that these systems are still there.
Yes, and if you might...
But why, let's move into this area now. But why is it still there? And why do Canadians and Australians and Nigerians and various people, Americans even, around the world take this so seriously and in many cases weep tears of
Well, I think largely it's all going back to the system, the rule of law, which we had. No matter how mighty you be, the law is above you. And since the days of King John and Magna Carta, the monarch has not had, although the monarch has not had absolute power. We got rid of absolute power very early on, which enabled individuals to be, an Englishman's home was his castle until the modern era. And that meant something. That meant something. If you give individual...
The cynics would say that the Magna Carta was just a bunch of barons protecting their own interests.
But it was still a retreat from an absolute type monarchy to some form of legal redress.
No, this is a point. This is a very good point. And the common law comes from the initial idea comes from Scandinavian law. Well, there's some Roman law in there too, but the idea of common law comes from handshake. Fides facti, I believe they call it. If I'm saying
Dictum
it right.
meum pactum.
Yeah.
In later
That's it. And it was a handshake. Now you had to rely on that. Boy, if we had to rely on that. Back then, if you didn't honor your deal, there would be a war and people would die.
Well, to this day, under English law, every contract, even a verbal contract, with the exception of property or real estate, as you like to say in America, with the exception of real estate contracts, every contract is enforceable. Whether you can prove it or not, of course, is another question.
You got to prove it, and that would be performance and reliance. But that's interesting. So, now, wait a second, because these are the roots: the trade, the law. Certainly, these are huge influences on the United States. And have been to this moment anyway. We'll see what the future holds. But it still doesn't answer the question why countries which ostensibly are free of the need or the reach of imperial Britain, the monarchy, still respect it and want to respect it. Australia and Canada, for example, perfectly viable societies don't need to have a monarchy, but yet they retain, along with many other Commonwealth countries, this connection. How do you explain that?
Well,
beyond just history, because the Spanish don't have it.
It's hotly debated.
The French don't have it.
It's hotly debated. You know, last week, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Prime Minister Jacinda, or Jacinda, I'm not sure if it's a soft or a hard J.
Yeah, I don't know.
Is it a J as in jogging?
Probably.
Anyway, she was saying, I'm not going to initiate this, but I expect in my lifetime New Zealand will say goodbye to the British monarchy.
Right.
So we'll see. I think, you know, right now we're in the afterglow and the nostalgia of the greatest reign in British history, 70 years, Queen Elizabeth II. Elizabeth the Great, she's already been dubbed. And so I think that, you know, all the dissenters are
as we've already established.
All the dissenters are keeping very quiet for now. But who knows what's around the corner?
But there are people on the right and the left who are against the monarchy. It's not just, you know, there are conservatives who are against the monarchy as well, right?
I think those conservatives who are against the monarchy maybe misunderstand that the monarchy is symbolic and has no power at all. And so you don't need to really worry about it that much. And look at all the value it brings in terms of tying a nation together.
And a Commonwealth, as we just discussed.
Commonwealth.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, the Commonwealth would not exist, I think, without the Queen.
Oh, I know what we should talk. I know what I was going to ask you both related to this. It's the old question. I hope it's not such a cliche that people start throwing things at their computers when they're watching this. But is Britain now where it was Rome? Is it now Greece? In the sense of its influences, its philosophical, lingual, and linguistic.
Well, that was always because he'd studied classics, of course. That was always the Harold Macmillan when he was Prime Minister. That the United Kingdom would be Greece to America's Rome. I'm not quite sure. I mean, part of the problem is that people don't study this enough these days, so they wouldn't know if they were Greece, even if it.
Well, Greece is the influence is pervasive till today.
But
I mean, it's the foundation of Western philosophy.
It is. Greece is the basis of our civilization. Essentially, it was Greek philosophy, and so then it carried forward with Roman law, which was then carried through the Dark Ages by the Catholic Church, in fact, preserving the documents, etc., which could be rediscovered for the Renaissance. And this is the basis, and that's why today's modern man in Europe who thinks he's so smart, old woman for that matter, that can chip away at the foundations and then worry, why is there a crack in the roof when I've chipped away at the foundations? And this is the problem. People, as I said earlier on in the programme, people don't understand when they're well off. And if we abandon this, because for our enemies across the world, I mean, the enemies to Western civilization are not abandoning their values, and they see our abandoning of our values as a sense of weakness. And we have an example across the border in Ukraine, because Putin probably thought the West will not do anything because they become decadent, self-absorbed. They're more concerned about transsexual lavatories at bus stops or whatever today's woke excess is.
Well, that may have been part of it. I mean, that's again a great subject.
Yeah, but we'll have to come back to another day.
You know, the vagaries of his mindset, put in as he was. We might say that that because of the preeminence of the English language and because of the history of trade and business, that in fact it makes sense to continue the Commonwealth, and in fact, with the exception of a very woke country like New Zealand, basically considering turning it over to the Maoris.
There are countries which had nothing to do with the British Empire which are queuing up to join the Commonwealth, which is quite interesting.
What?
There are members of the Commonwealth which had nothing to do with the British Empire. And new countries are trying to join even as we speak, which is quite fascinating, including French-speaking ones.
Yeah. It was part of the idea of Brexit was that you would have the Commonwealth. It's a lot of countries. How many countries is it?
54, I think.
Yeah, it's a huge amount. Yeah. I mean, if that is a trading bloc that works, it's massive. And if, in fact, the strength is law and trade and linguistics, a common language, then, not linguistics, but a common language, then it makes sense.
And King Charles III is, of course, monarch of 14 other countries.
Thank you for mentioning his name.
Yes.
Because in the final minutes, what do you think? Is he going to be able to follow this act?
Yes.
I mean, this portrayal, this performance.
I mean, it won't be the same because a woman who's been queen for 70 years, and if we're lucky, Prince Charles might manage 20. Well, King Charles III, as he now is, takes some getting used to, doesn't it? But yes, I think no Prince of Wales has served a longer apprenticeship. No Prince of Wales, when he was Prince of Wales, learned about his country and its people. No Prince of Wales did more for the people. I'm thinking of his charitable work through the Prince's Trust, giving inner city people an opportunity to form business, all the sort of behind-the-scenes work which he did, which he doesn't get a lot of credit for. So I think he'd be an excellent king, and I think we're very lucky to have him.
Yeah, and when people mention the past, I'll come to you in a second, Guy, because I know you want burning to say something. But when it comes to you had a burning look on your head. You're going to singe my beard if I had one. And people forget about the Diana business really in the end. Because if you look at history and if you look at your own family, there's plenty of always, you can never predict. Really.
Folk are only human at the end of the day.
We're only human. Yeah, even the monarchy is only human, but their symbolic status is the important part. Guy.
I was just going to say, and for balance, that King Charles, he's had the longest apprenticeship as a Prince of Wales, and so fully understands the role, but the nature of the beast means that it's quite hard for him to stay out of politics, and his views on the environment, for example, are very well known, and therefore he's going to have to tread carefully with that mandate to stay away from political interference, I think, because a lot of people feel very, very strongly, particularly today, on the question of net zero and greenery, and so on. But and he's fully signed up to this idea that we're in a climate existential crisis, and that's hotly debated, to put it mildly.
Yeah, that's another program. I welcome you both back for some of these other issues.
Sorry, no, you were going to say.
Sorry, now, gosh, yes. Knowing a bit about the Constitution of 3rd of May, I just wanted to tie that. I wanted to say something about that at the end. I've just been shooting a documentary about the Warsaw Uprising over the last week, and one of the things that came up in my wanderings was the Constitution of 3rd of May, Constitution of 3rd of May, which follows from the Magna Carta. So you have the example of the Magna Carta, you have the example of the British constitutional monarchy. This had a big effect on what happened in Poland, being the first, take it from there, the first continental.
Well, it was the first continental vote, yes, of course.
So that what I'm trying to show at the end in this last moment is that constitutional monarchy had a position in Poland first.
Yeah, of course, it did have a position here, about 100 years after in the UK, of course, but I take no point on that. No, but I think the point is to get back to why do you have monarchy? It's tradition, it's what G.K. Chesterton said, essentially, that tradition is the vote we give to those who came before us, the democracy of the dead, which provides balance for, as he put it, the selfish, the arrogant oligarchy which just happened to be wandering about us today. In other words, tradition is the weight we give to what we've learnt from the past, and helping us, therefore, to see the present in context and to preserve what is good for the future. We do not have any right today, because we happen to be alive, to destroy everything of value, because that's the whim we have today. And that's why revolutions always fail, ultimately.
Well said, gentlemen. Thank you for being here.
Of course, was a Catholic.
He was a Catholic, I know. Hilaire Belloc.
Yeah, another great one.
We've got to go. That's it. That's all we got time for. I want to thank Guy Pinsent.
Thank you.
And I want to thank Nicholas Richardson for being friends, and also for coming in and taking time out of your busy schedules to be here and talk about this important subject. Okay? Sure. And which we all dressed up for, including me.
Well done.
I promise to be less dressed up the next time you see me, and possibly wearing a baseball cap. At any rate, did I say you're looking well, and stay that way.